Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carter.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carter. Today is March 1st, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about Project Looking Glass. Is it a spectacle, secrecy, or just an engineering test? Well, we're going to find out because I did a deep dive into this subject. So this investigation takes a disciplined look at the claims surrounding Project Looking Glass, Project Aquarius, S4, gravity propulsion, and alleged time manipulation technology. Now, rather than dismissing the story or embracing it, this broadcast applies a structural test. If gravity can be engineered and time can be influenced, what real-world infrastructure would necessarily exist? And what facilities, power systems, metrology, contracting ecosystems, and bureaucratic footprints would have to appear? And do they appear anywhere in the documentary record? Well, using the Aquarius documents, Bob Lazar, Lazar-era references, CIA consciousness research releases, NSA FOIA material, Area 51's verified history, and recent oversight testimony, well, this episode separates spectacle from structure. It examines how certain narratives protect themselves from falsification through compartmentalization language and deferred disclosure. And it contrasts those mechanisms with how genuine classified programs behave over time. The goal here is clarity, not ridicule, filtration, not fear. Now, if a program changes physics, it changes infrastructure. If it changes infrastructure, it leaves fingerprints. So this broadcast asks a simple but rigorous question. Are those fingerprints present? Or are we looking at a story sustained by coherence rather than by material evidence? This also comes from one of our listeners who was quite interested. A few actually have been asking me to do Project Looking Glass, and so that's why we're doing it tonight. Shout out to everybody on the live chat, Rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion saying, hey, Pastor. Hey, warrior family. Glad to be back with y'all. Thank you, Scorpion. Glad you're here on the live chat Rumble. Number two warrior is Boots Hafner. Boots saying, hello, Pastor James Carter of the Rumble Airwaves and creator of ElitePotion.com. And hello, warrior family. Glad to see y'all. And let's help out our host by hitting that thumbs up button. Thank you very much, Boots. Yes, if you could all do me a favor, take your thumb, follow me down to your cell phone, hit the X, and then hit thumbs up, then hit live chat. Or if you're listening to this at a later note, please hit the thumbs up. This helps with the algorithm because the algorithm only allows me to grow if I have more likes. That is, if you like the program. And number three warrior is Edge, given the jumping banana, then saying, hi, James and everyone. What's up, Edge? Thank you for being here. And number four warrior is Jeffrey, saying, hey, y'all and everyone, wishing all you good and amazing week and weekend. Well, God bless you too. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Let's get straight into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carter, offering his shitty opinion.
Well, a dramatic moment as Iran's retaliatory missile barrage hits Israel. Ooh, how many times have missiles hit Israel from Iran? I mean, dude, we're talking just thousands over periods of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different days. I mean, it's just nonstop, right? So it's not like it's anything new. This is so normal, right? I mean, it's terrible. It's tragic. You know, people are dying. Missiles are being sent. But, you know, they've been dragging this story since the 60s, right? Oh, we're going to get nuclear weapons. Whatever. I just say this is all being used to fluctuate oil prices, to keep the elite happy and in power and control. But I really do believe that this is basically a fight against China and Russia, who have had control over northern Iran and their black market oil, right? I do believe that China and Russia have been doing this illegally. And this is us forcing them to get back on the legal page internationally and follow international orders when it comes to shipping I guess you could call it a controlled substance. Oil is highly dangerous. It's dangerous to work with, and people can die. And that's why there are regulations in place, regardless if they work or not, but regulations in place to do things right, to ship it from A to B correctly without, serious damage. Now, not to say that it works all the time, but this is what the right, or not the right, I wouldn't say right, but this is what the West it wants. And it's using legality terms in order to do what they did to Iran. So Iran is guilty of breaking international law, and that's how Trump's able to shoot a couple bombs in there. And nobody, where's World War III? Everyone was freaking out. What happened there? Well, I said right from the beginning, this isn't that big of a deal. This is just forcing Russia and China to pay for oil and not sneak behind countries and steal it. Trump says likely more deaths of U.S. troops to come before the Iran conflict ends. Well, yeah, that's going to happen when we are going in and we're taking out a regime and adding our own. That's what's happening. U.S. troops killed amid Iranian counterattack, fueling air defense fears. Ooh, well, here's the thing. Okay, do you guys remember Syria? Okay, you remember Syria when Syria was controlled by the Russians, and then when we got rid of Assad or whatever his name was, he hightailed it out of there to Russia for to seek asylum. Yeah, this is the same thing with Iran, except we just killed the leader and his son and daughter, or his son and wife, I believe. But it's nothing to really worry about. This is Israel growing. Yeah, they're growing. So that's really what's going on. It's surreal, according to Iranians, in disbelief after Supreme Leader is killed. It's surreal. I didn't think Americans could do it. We loved him. He kept us. We kept his thumb on us, and we like that. No, God. Most of Iranians are actually rejoicing right now, and they're praising Trump. Yeah. Now, I don't like the guy, but they're praising him. And whatever's happening in Iran is probably better for them now than it ever has been since the 60s. Iran conflict as Israel targets Hezbollah in Lebanon. Well, if you're in Iran, duck and cover. Disgusting and evil, according to USA Today, saying Trump faces MAGA backlash on Iran. No. No, he's not. Everyone on the right always believed in the whole Israel bullshit. So attacking Iran is, well, biblical. They're like, bring it on, as everybody's so tired of this apocalyptic bullshit that we've been going through the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And everyone basically is saying, bring it on. Jesus, let's do it. Take the wheel. Let's go. So nobody really is worried. So the news don't even know what to print anymore. They're a bunch of pansies. And that's the
Welcome to
news. Oh, and I hit the wrong button. All right. When we come back, we're going to be talking about Project Looking Glass. Is it a spectacle, secrecy, or an engineering test? Well, we'll find out soon. Stick around.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Every year, millions of Americans sign a contract they don't even know exists. They think it's just another tax return, but that signature means something far deeper. It starts with that first job at 16. The system takes a piece of her check, then promises to give some back if she signs the return. Every April 15th, the same cycle repeats, not by law, but by belief. The system didn't bind them, their own signature did. Learn the truth at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, we're back. Let's get into the truth here, folks. Tonight we're talking about Project Looking Glass. Is it a spectacle, secrecy, and an engineering test? Well, we're going to find out tonight because I did a deep dive. I downloaded every single book I could possibly find. There's only probably a total of maybe 5 books that have been written about it, but none of them really go into any detail. There have been several whistleblowers, including Dan Burish, that I grabbed all of his information. I put it into there. And there's also a bunch of patents and Freedom of Information Act information that I went through. And so I didn't just, take this lightly. I wanted to find out the truth. And the truth means we can only find what we can find, okay? I don't have access to classified information. I can only gather information and make the best educated guess. But when it comes to that, I cannot ever just say, oh, it's true, it's real, be scared. That's not how I work anymore. 2-3 years ago, I used to be fanatic, and I was uncontrolled when it came to information. And I decided when I started this show that I would hold myself accountable to the truth. And what I'm learning is that when I do this correctly, meaning when I don't just assume and I do it with the truth, whether whether we can find out if some of these conspiracy theories are real or not, if we can use the truth makes us free, not lies. You see, we cannot use Satan's system to fight Satan's system. That means making crap up and being hyper realistic about something that isn't real. So that's what Satan wants. And then if we play by his rules, we're not going to get the truth out. So we have to hold ourselves accountable to stuff like this. And that's what I did today. And what came out, you're going to be interested and surprised. So there are moments in history when secrecy and spectacle begin to overlap. And when they do, discernment becomes difficult. We know secrecy is real. Black government programs are real. Compartmentalization is real. Governments do not publish every capability that they develop, and they never have. But we also know that spectacle is real. Myth grows in the shadows of secrecy, and when those two forces merge, the public conversation can drift away from structure and into a simple story. Well, Project Looking Glass sits exactly in that tension. We're told there was a gravity propulsion project. We are told there was a beam weapon project. We are told there was a time project. And we are told that these were all hidden inside S4, which is another area of Area 51, under layers of compartmentalization so deep that they were designed to confuse anyone who tried to trace them. And we were told that gravity could be harnessed, amplified, and lensed. We were also told that time could be affected. We were told that convergence events were observed, and we were told that the future was seen and used against us. Well, that's the claim. But claims are not evidence. Classification language is not evidence. Repetition across interviews is not evidence. Emotional testimony is not evidence. The only way to move forward is to translate story into structure through data. If gravity can be engineered, then engineering must exist. If time can be influenced, then instrumentation must exist. If gravity waves are being lensed, then power systems, containment systems, metrology systems, and facilities must exist. If a program changes physics, well, it changes infrastructure, and infrastructure leaves fingerprints. This is not cynicism. That is physics and bureaucracy. Real black budget programs still obey constraints. They require power. They require materials. They require fabrication. And they require supply chains. They require contractors. They require test iterations. They require safety protocols. They require documentation. Even when classified, they leave indirect traces over time. Secrecy can hide names, but it cannot erase engineering demands. And this is where the question sharpens. Does Project Looking Glass leave engineering fingerprints, or does it leave theatrical ones? Well, there's a difference between a program that hides its name and a story that hides its evidence. There's also a difference between compartmentalization and narrative immunity. When a document tells you that its own structure was designed to confuse investigators, unquote, well, that is not proof of depth. It is protection against falsification. When disclosure is always promised at some future date, that never arrives. Now, that is not validation, that's just delay. Now, this broadcast, it's not about mocking anyone. It's not about defending institutions. It's not about blind trust. It's about filtration. Because real oversight questions exist. Real classified acceleration exists. Real aerospace advancement exists. But those realities do not automatically validate gravity time devices and timeline convergence claims. So tonight we apply a simple test. We take the claims as they are presented. We translate them into engineering requirements. We translate those requirements into bureaucratic realities. And then we ask whether the fingerprints are there. If they are, we will say so. If they're not, we will say that too. Because fascination without filtration is how spectacle thrives. And discipline without fear is how truth survives. And I'm really more interested in the truth. So let's begin. So before anything can be tested, guys, it must be stated clearly, not exaggerated, not softened, not mocked, just stated. The Project Aquarius and S4 narrative presents a structured hierarchy of secret programs operating beneath a large compartment, sometimes referred to as majesty. Inside that structure, three primary technical tracks are described. The first is Project Galileo. This is framed as the propulsion branch. According to the claim, Galileo involved the study of gravity not as a passive force, but as a controllable medium. The language used is deliberate. It describes harnessing, amplifying, and lensing gravity waves. Well, the premise is that gravity can be engineered the way light can be engineered, bent and focused. If gravity can be manipulated, propulsion becomes fundamentally different from combustion, thrust, or reactive mass. Movement would not push against air or expel propellant. It would distort the space around the craft itself. And that's what we learned when we heard about the Nazi Bell, Project Gluten Bell or something like that. And that was a Project Paperclip part to where we took that engineering that the Nazis were doing and brought it over to America, where they were able to shift time and space around a bell-looking technology, and it was able to move. Well, the problem they had that we had from documentation is that they just couldn't fire bullets from space and time because it wouldn't hit during the time that they wanted it to. But that's what we heard. And that's from a little bit of information that we could get out of that whole thing. So remember, it's all about what you can prove, not how you feel. So the second track is Project, and let's go back. Project Galileo is real, okay? They figured out a way to take gravity and play around with it. Now, the second track is Project Sidekick. This is presented as the weaponization branch. If gravity can be lensed, the narrative claims it could also be collimated into a beam and focused at a target. Gravity can be focused at a target. Huh? Well, the story asserts that gravity itself becomes a delivery mechanism for energy concentration. In this telling, propulsion and weaponization are two sides of the same physics breakthrough. Once gravity is controlled, both movement and force projection becomes possible. So, Project Sidekick is real. And yes, they have collimated it into a beam and have been focusing on targets. They've been playing around with it. The third track is Project Looking Glass. This is the time branch. Here, the claim expands beyond propulsion and weapons and into temporal effects. The narrative suggests that artificially produced gravity waves affect time itself. It frames control of space-time as the ultimate capability. Well, if gravity and time are inseparable under general relativity, then manipulating one influence the other, right? So in the mythology, this is where future viewing, timeline observation, and convergence claims under the picture. Now, if you remember what I said in the beginning, this was a theory, okay? This is in this mythology. I'm not saying that the third one, Project Looking Glass, is real and they're working on it or have. We just don't have the proof, but this is what they tell us it does. So the first two, Sidekick and Galileo, they're real. The third, Project Looking Glass, well, it's a little harder to find information on that. So that is the internal logic here. Gravity is the master key. Propulsion is the first door. Weaponization is the second. Time is the final chamber here. So the structure, the threes, well, it's not chaotic. It's pretty coherent, and it moves from physical mobility to strategic dominance to temporal supremacy. Meaning, if the last one, Looking Glass, is real and they were able to do it, we're looking at a weapon that's beyond what we could ever dream of having. But that coherence is important because it explains why the story persists. It offers a complete ladder of power. And above these projects, the narrative places an umbrella compartment described as intentionally fragmented. The language suggests that tracing authority upward is nearly impossible because the structure itself was designed to confuse. That's a quote. Compartmentalization is not simply security in this framework. It is the explanation for no confirming documentation can be found. The absence of trace becomes part of the architecture. So this is the claim spine here, okay? It does not revolve around random alien gossip. It revolves around a single technical breakthrough. Engineered gravity and everything else flows from that premise. If gravity can be amplified and focused, then propulsion changes. And if propulsion changes, weapons change. If gravity and time are linked, then time effects become plausible within the same research domain. But do we have any time guns? Well, before we accept or reject anything here, we must acknowledge that the narrative is internally consistent. It is built like a pyramid. And that is precisely why it must be translated into engineering reality, okay? Because that's the only data we have to really work with. Because it's secret. It's a secret, okay? Because internal coherence is not the same thing as external verification. So the next step is not belief. The next step is translation of the material we do have. Now, once the claim spine is laid out, you guys know what it is? The next question is not whether it's dramatic, The next question is whether it is independently corroborated. And this is where a pattern begins to emerge, not in physics, but in repetition. The same project name appears again and again across separate narrative streams: Project Galileo, Project Looking Glass, S4, Majesty. Now, the names do not appear once in a single document and then disappear. They circulate, they migrate, they resurface in interviews, in books, in testimony references, in online disclosures, and in secondhand retellings. But what is striking is not their frequency. It is their containment within the same ecosystem. Bob Lazar's late 1980s claim placed him at S4 near Groom Lake, describing propulsion systems allegedly derived from recovered craft. Years later, Project Aquarius documents circulate assigning propulsion research to Project Galileo and time research to Project Looking Glass. Well, later still, disclosure-era testimony references the same nouns as historical claims. So the names remain stable, but the evidentiary base does not expand. Well, this matters because independent corroboration requires independent sourcing. It also requires documents from different origins that converge unexpectedly. It requires witnesses whose accounts intersect without borrowing from one another's language. So what we see, instead of lexical recycling, we see the same vocabulary circulates inside the same belief community, and the same architecture repeats. But that does not prove fabrication. But it does demonstrate narrative reinforcement rather than independent discovery. Now, real classified programs behave differently in the public sphere. Even when their official names are hidden, indirect references leak through procurement notices, contractor biographies, academic research shifts, patent trails, budget anomalies, or inspector general reviews years later. Independent researchers discover fragments that were not intentionally coordinated. The fragments do not rely on the same handful of nouns. Now, in the Looking Glass ecosystem, the nouns are stable and central. Galileo is propulsion. Looking Glass is time. Majesty is umbrella authority. Well, S4 is the physical stage for it. And the names anchor the myth. And they circulate primarily through testimony, derivative documents, and retellings rather than through independently verifiable channels. So there is another subtle pattern at work here. Each time the story resurfaces, it adds emotional gravity but not structural detail. The emphasis remains on beings, secrecy, compartmentalization, and future disclosure rather than on engineering constraints, failure models, instrumentation tolerances, or program management structure. Well, the narrative becomes richer in atmosphere, sure, but not richer in auditability, meaning can we find any audit trail of this information? And when a story grows in repetition, but not in verifiable depth, that is a signal. It suggests that the reinforcement mechanism is social, not industrial. The ecosystem sustains itself through internal coherence and shared vocabulary, rather than through expanded documentary record. And this is where the investigation must turn. If the names recycle but the infrastructure does not surface, then the repetition itself becomes part of the evidence. Not evidence of truth, but evidence of how the narrative propagates. So the next step for us is not to attack the people who repeat the names. The next step is to take the central technical claim, engineered gravity, and translate it out of narrative space and into engineering space. Because if gravity can be lensed, the universe does not care about story consistency. It cares about power requirements, measurement precision, and facility scale. And those are harder to recycle, folks. So now the claim must leave narrative space and enter engineering space. The central premise is gravity manipulation, not metaphorical gravity, not influence literal physical gravity waves that can be harnessed, amplified, and lensed. The propulsion branch assumes that gravity can be shaped around a craft. The weapon branch assumes gravity can be collimated into a focused beam. Well, the time branch assumes artificially produced gravity waves can influence temporal behavior. Well, that is a physics claim. So what would that mean in the real world? First, energy. Gravity is not an easily manipulated force. It is the weakest of the four fundamental interactions at human scales. The gravitational attraction between everyday objects is negligible compared to electromagnetic forces. To generate measurable gravitational effects artificially would require extraordinary energy density or exotic mass configurations for far beyond conventional engineering, meaning we would need power systems. Maybe not just one nuclear energy facility, but two. If a lab were truly amplifying gravity waves, well, the power infrastructure alone would be immense. High energy experimentation leaves signatures: transformers, cooling systems, shielding, safety protocols, and hardened facilities. Even if it's classified, such systems still require physical footprint. Here's the second measurement. You cannot manipulate what you cannot measure. Gravitational effects are detected today using extremely sensitive interferometry. Interferometry. I don't know what that is and what it means, but it is a word. Interferometry. It's modern gravitational wave observatories that require kilometers long vacuum tunnels and isolation from seismic noise. Those are designed to detect cosmic scale events like black hole mergers because terrestrial gravitational disturbances are so small. If a program were artificially producing gravity waves, the instrumentation required to measure and control those waves would have to be equally sophisticated and isolated. Well, vibration control, electromagnetic shielding, thermal stabilization, vacuum environments, they all would be essential. So these are not minor lab adjustments. They are facility scale requirements. Now, can the government create the energy to create all that shit? Sure. And keep it off-site? Sure. I mean, they have nuclear submarines that has its own energy, and it can be its own energy for 150 years without ever having to check the core. That's what we've been able to do with nuclear energy. But that runs a submarine. We're talking about taking gravity, bending it into a lens so we can see into the future. Do you think the sub would be able to, can you plug it into the sub and then turn on your little tiny megawatt machine? I don't know. Third, materials and fabrication need to be bought, right? Lensing gravity implies shaping space-time curvature intentionally. Well, that suggests either extreme mass density, exotic matter states, superconductive systems, or high-field electromagnetic analogs tied to speculative unified field models. Even if one assumes breakthroughs through public physics, the materials science challenge would be staggering. Custom fabrication shops, cryogenic systems, precision machining, field containment structures, all those requires vendor ecosystem and specialized personnel. So something like that would offer fingerprints. Fourth would be safety. High energy physics experimentation is not quiet work. Even in classified programs, there are safety standards, hazard assessments, and containment procedures. Radiation risk, electromagnetic exposure, structural stress, catastrophic failure scenarios, these must be modeled and mitigated. A gravity beam experiment, if real, would demand extensive fail-safes and test protocols. Accidents in advanced research environments generate internal reports, medical monitoring, and infrastructure response systems. Fifth, would need a program scale, and a big one. A gravity time research branch would not consist of a handful of individuals with briefings in a conference room. It would require teams with physicists, engineers, technicians, fabrication specialists, power engineers, safety officers, program managers, nothing that Dan Burish mentioned. Even compartmentalized that creates career footprints, right? Compartmentalization does leave career footprints. It creates expertise pipelines, and it creates patterns of hiring and movement within the defense ecosystem. And then here's the critical point. Even if the program name were hidden, the engineering demand would not be. Power lines will still need to be installed, cooling systems still need to be built, materials still need to be sourced, specialized components still need to be fabricated, facilities need to be reinforced, personnel still need to be cleared and trained, contractors still need to deliver hardware. Engineering is constrained by physics, and bureaucracy is constrained by logistics. So the claim that gravity can be harnessed in lens is not impossible in the philosophical sense, but it is extraordinarily expensive in the practical sense. And expense programs leave patterns. And when stealth aircraft were developed, the public did not know the details, but unusual aircraft sightings occurred. Test ranges expanded, and contractor ecosystems evolved. Eventually, declassification confirmed the work, and the same pattern applies to high energy research programs. Even when the content is hidden, the infrastructure footprint eventually becomes visible in indirect ways. Excuse me. So the test here becomes clear. If gravity wave lensing and time manipulation were operational research domains, where is the infrastructure footprint? Where are the measurable facility expansions tied to high energy gravitational experimentation? Where are the contractor ecosystems specializing in gravitational metrology? Where are the safety protocols adapted to exotic field manipulation? And where are the derivatives technologies that would inevitably spill into adjacent domains over time? Well, the narrative gives us nouns. Engineering demands us constraints. And the universe does not bend to narrative coherence. It bends to power, mass, and measurement precisions. So the next step is to examine how real black programs operate and whether these operational fingerprints align with the looking glass claim. This is where we get into bureaucracy in physics. So physics imposes constraints on matter and energy. Bureaucracy imposes constraints on programs. And in the world of classified research, those constraints are just as real. It is easy to imagine a secret laboratory operating outside all normal systems. It is harder to accept that even the most classified program still runs on paperwork, procurement, logistics, and personnel management. The special access program may hide its name. It may restrict its visibility. It may limit who knows its purpose, but it still must obey the mechanics of organization. If a gravity time research effort existed, it would not simply require scientists and engineers. It would require contracting officers to negotiate hardware builds. It would require budget authorities to allocate funds. It would require compliance officers to track materials and manage audits. It would also require facility managers to oversee utilities and physical plant modifications. It would require security teams to manage clearances and compartmentalized access lists. Every one of those functions generates records, even when classified. Now, secrecy changes distribution. It does not erase progress. Now, consider the scale implied by engineered gravity research. High energy systems demand sustained funding across multiple fiscal years. That means line items, even if buried within black budgets. It means program objective memoranda, milestone reviews, technical assessments, and continuation approvals. It means internal disagreements about feasibility and risk. It means iteration failure, redesign, and more iteration. Well, programs do not move from theoretical breakthrough to operational capability in silence and isolation. They move through review cycles. And even if the review documents remain classified, the existence of such a program would produce patterns. Individuals would develop specialized expertise. Careers would form around gravitational modeling and exotic field control. And contractors would build reputations for providing niche components. Universities might quietly see research funding shifts into certain subfields. Patents, even heavily redacted ones, might surface in adjacent areas. So over decades, these patterns become detectable. Well, when stealth aircraft were under development, the public did not know the details, but we were using stealth aircraft in Vietnam. And they didn't release it till the late 80s, and some of the people who were involved in the project were pretty pissed about that because they were able to keep it hidden for 20 years so far. But something unusual was happening. Test flights occurred. Range activity increased. Contractors hired aggressively in certain specialties. Eventually, the curtain lifted and the infrastructure behind the secrecy was obviously in hindsight, meaning they couldn't keep it a secret anymore. Remember, I've been saying this on my show that the military are awesome at keeping a secret for 20 years. And after that, they can't, and they know this. So they're always on a time crunch when it comes to that. So if Project Looking Glass was real and it was in the 80s, we would see the evidence of it coming out by now. So that's something to consider. Now, I'm not saying it's not real or not. I'm just saying there really should be some footprints by now, unless the military has been able to harness time and then do these projects somewhere else in time, because it's not in our time. So bureaucracy actually leaves sediment, folks. It really does. Now, contrast that with the structure of the Looking Glass narrative. The story emphasizes compartmentalization as a defense mechanism. It suggests that tracing authority is nearly impossible because the architecture was designed to confuse. Well, that framing does something subtle. It implies that the normal bureaucratic sediment should not exist, or if it does, it is permanently inaccessible. But here is the reality. Confusion can slow inquiry, but it cannot eliminate the physical demand of sustaining a large-scale technical effort. The more exotic the physics claim, the greater the logistical burden. And the greater the logistical burden, the more internal structure must exist to support it. So a gravity time program would not operate like a rumor. It would operate like an enterprise. And this is why bureaucracy is physics too. It constrains what can exist and how it must function. You can hide a project's purpose, but you cannot hide its need for electricity, personnel, facilities, contracts, and review cycles. Even if the public never sees the documents, the institutional ecosystem adopts around the program. So the test deepens. And this explains why the stealth bomber and stealth fighter were released in the late 80s, because, well, the sediment finally showed its surface. So the test then deepens. And where is the institutional adaptation consistent with gravity time engineering? Where are the long-term expertise clusters? Where are the contractor pipelines? Where are the facility expansions tailored to extreme metrology? Where are the spillover effects into related technologies? Well, you all say, Mandela. Well, some have claimed that the Mandela effect is the military going around and telling companies to change their logos on purpose. And to do that on purpose to give the appearance, the idea that there is Looking Glass, because they were working on something else entirely. That's all I'm saying. I don't know. I remember personally, the Zapruder film was a limo with 4 people. I don't remember the governor and his wife ever being there, and Kenny was shot. But they have the ability to literally condition us just through our own phones, okay, through screen manipulation. That's a patent. So they could get us to believe in certain things through manipulating our minds. So keep that in mind. But where are the facility expansions that are tailored to extreme metrology? Where is it? Well, the absence of those patterns does not automatically prove non-existence, but the larger the claim, the larger the footprint must be. That's logic. That's science, okay? And I'm surprised that some people who are just brainiacs would fall for something so fast without taking a step back and looking at the big picture. Now, I fell for it, okay? I remember back in the early 2000s and studying Dan Burish and watching him on Project Camelot and watching him get interviewed, and he's talking about J-Rod and how he became friends with them and J-Rod healed him and all this crap. And I was excited about it because here's the deal. These are things we want to believe is true. Well, just because you want something to be true doesn't mean it is. And that's what sucks about growing up and being an adult. We have to look at this from, a mature way, a logical way, and not just assume that something is real because there are 5 whistleblowers who all say the same thing. They sometimes will I'm talking about the military, they will throw whistleblowers out there on purpose. And they could even MK Ultra their brain to tell them to stick to the same story. They can condition them. They can split their personalities to get them to think that they really were there. And they can even take polygraph tests and pass. But it doesn't mean it's real. Okay? So here's where the story meets the structure. The next step is to ground this discussion in something verified, a real classified site with documented history, and compare how it behaves to how the looking glass narrative describes the S4 behaving, okay? Now, if we are going to test a claim about S4, gravity propulsion and time manipulation, we need a verified control case, okay? This is like Journalism 101. We need a place that is real, classified, and historically secret, but documented enough that we can observe how real black programs behave over time. Well, Area 51 is that control case. And they denied it for many years until finally in the 80s, everyone decided to go look over there. So Groom Lake was acquired in the 1950s as a test site for the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. Aircraft that goes really, 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 really high that rockets can't shoot down. That's all. And they're too fast to shoot down. So it later hosted the A-12 Oxcart program and became essential to stealth aircraft development. And there is evidence that they're still working on stealth aircraft. Now, for decades, the existence of the base itself was not officially acknowledged. Employees were flown in undercover. You've seen the white with red stripe airplanes going from Vegas to Groom Lake. Test flights occurred at night. The surrounding airspace was tightly restricted. The culture of secrecy was intense. And they were able to keep a lot of things secret for a long time. And yet, despite that secrecy, patterns were visible. Usual aircraft shapes were sighted. Aviation enthusiasts tracked test flights. Contractor ecosystems grew around Lockheed Skunk Works. Aerospace engineering talent concentrated in specific pipelines. There's paperwork for all this. Budget allocations flowed into stealth materials research. Over time, derivative technologies emerged in radar-absorbent materials and low observable design principles. Eventually, the F-117 or F-117 and later stealth programs were publicly revealed. Well, because people are starting to ask questions. We've got all these patents, and we've got all this other stuff. They're like, okay, so secrecy delayed its disclosure, but it did not erase the infrastructure. So the mythology surrounding Area 51 flourished precisely because something real was happening there. So people saw the lights. They saw unconventional flight patterns. They noticed restricted airspace expansions. And in the absence of information, imagination filled in the gap. So UFO narratives then multiplied. And this is why people were racing to, Rachel, Nevada, and camping in Spain and I looking up in the sky. But when I did it, I even went up to the gate. I even put my foot inside the gate and then looked at the white truck and said, come, 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 come. They didn't do dick. They were just laughing at me because I didn't cross the gate fully. I just put one foot in, not the other. But when the programs were declassified, the explanation turned out to be advanced aircraft testing. Extraordinary for its time in the late 80s. Yeah. No, we didn't even know we had it. It was there. We're like, holy crap. And when we looked at the birds, we were freaking out, the first image of it, because they didn't look like anything we've ever seen before. But still within the bounds of physics and engineering constraints, meaning when it came out, we knew what they built was possible. And we knew then where to find the rest of the materials that were being given to them. So we could trace that as well. But the secrecy was real. The work was real. The myth grew all around it. Now apply that pattern to the S4 and Looking Glass claims. If S4 were hosting gravity propulsion and time manipulation experiments, it would represent a leap far beyond stealth materials and aerodynamic innovation. It would represent a fundamental shift in our relationship to space-time itself. And the infrastructure demands would dwarf even those of stealth development. So where are the equivalent indirect indicators? Where are the unusual energy supply expansions tailored to exotic field research? Where are the contractor ecosystems specializing in gravitational metrology? And where are the spillover materials technology hinting at gravity manipulation research? Where are the eventual declassifications revealing incremental progress, even decades later? So, in the case of stealth aircraft, the infrastructure footprint preceded public acknowledgement. The secrecy masked details, but not existence. Well, in the case of Looking Glass, the narrative precedes infrastructure. Precedes. And the story describes world-altering capability, but the structural sediment that would accompany such a capability is just not evident. This does not mean that Groom Lake is just simply mundane. It remains a highly classified test facility, and it may still host advanced programs unknown to the public. But its documented history shows how real black budgets behave. They generate ecosystems. They leave indirect traces. And they eventually produce technology that integrates into broader military architecture. So the S4 gravity time narrative, by contrast, emphasizes compartmentalization and mythic breakthrough without corresponding institutional evolution visible over decades. So Area 51 teaches a very important lesson for us. Remember, we're Christians, okay? We're not supposed to believe everything we read. God wants us to remain focused and sober. And he doesn't want us to run off with our emotions just because it sounds like it's a good idea or sounds believable. He wants us to stay grounded so we can keep others who are freaking out and get them back to ground, okay? That's our job, is to love our neighbor. And loving our neighbor is telling them the truth as you see it. Because when you get to the truth, it makes you free because it slows you down and it's not as crazy and nuts as you thought it was. And that's what God wants. He wants you to have peace. He doesn't want you to freak out. So secrecy breeds speculation, okay? Real projects can inspire extraordinary rumors. But when the curtain lifts, the truth tends to align with engineering progression and not physics revolution. If gravity propulsion and time manipulation were being tested at scale, we would expect to see a similar pattern. Unusual, but trackable evolution within aerospace and physics domains. We haven't seen that. And the absence of the pattern becomes part of the evaluation. So the next step is to examine how the Aquarius narrative protects itself from this kind of comparison and why its structure resists the very filtration that we're applying here. So at this point, the investigation turns from physics and bureaucracy to something way more subtle: how the story protects itself. Well, the Aquarius S4 narrative does not merely present technical claims, it embeds defensive architecture inside those claims. It anticipates the very questions we are asking and provides an answer in advance. Compartmentalization is not simply described as security, it's described as deliberate fragmentation designed to prevent traceability. So authority is layered upward into structures that cannot be followed. Documentation is said to exist, but to be permanently sequestered. Records are implied to be destroyed, misled, or misfiled, or hidden inside higher compartments. Well, in effect, the absence of verifiable evidence becomes proof of how well the system is working. Well, that is not engineering. That is narrative immunization. When a claim says you cannot find the infrastructure because the infrastructure was designed to be untraceable, it has insulated itself against structural testing. So the normal tools of verification are declared ineffective by definition. And another mechanism is deferred disclosure. The story often promises that evidence will be released at the right time. Well, dates are then suggested, windows are hinted at, announcements are implied, but when nothing materializes, the timeline then shifts. Disclosure becomes perpetually imminent but never present. This keeps emotional investment alive without exposing the claim to falsification. So then there is the authority tone. Classification markings, compartment names, military acronyms, the use of language like briefed, read in, OPR, top secret. These elements create atmosphere. They mimic the cadence of real classified documents, but tone is not provenance. Formatting is not chain of custody, and authority language can be replicated without authority substance. And there is also theological escalation embedded in some versions of the narrative, artifacts that contain infinite knowledge, beings that influenced human religion, convergence events tied to destiny. Well, these elements raise the emotional stakes beyond engineering and existential territory, meaning we're going into emotion rather than logic. So once a story touches theology and cosmic inevitability, well, it becomes more than a technical claim. It becomes a worldview territory. Then we freak out. Well, our job is not to freak out. And worldview territory is far harder to interrogate calmly. So all of these mechanisms serve as the same function. They reduce the surface area available for falsification. A falsifiable claim invites testing. An immune claim explains why testing cannot succeed. So this is an accusation of malice. It is an observation of structure. When enduring myths survive, not because they are proven, but because they are constructed in ways that deflect standard evaluation. So compare that with how real classified programs behave. Genuine SAPs do not rely on mythic framing to sustain themselves, okay? They don't rely on alien talk. They rely on access control, need-to-know enforcement, and legal consequence. They do not promise future dramatic disclosure. They never have. They simply remain restricted until declassification cycles or oversight pressure shift. Now, the difference is quiet, but it's significant. Real programs do not need narrative protection. They have institutional protection. So stories need narrative protection because they lack institutional scaffolding. And when you see compartmentalization used as an explanation for why no measurable infrastructure can be identified, well, you're looking at narrative immunity in action. Never even heard of that, have you? Narrative immunity. When you see disclosure perpetually deferred, you are looking at attention retention in action. Attention retention in action. So when you see classification tone without verifiable chain of custody, you are looking at atmospheric authority rather than documented authority. You're looking at something that may be made up on purpose to steer you away from them. So the more extraordinary the claim, folks, the more pressure it must withstand. If a program alters gravity and time, it should withstand engineering scrutiny. And if scrutiny is redirected into maze-like compartments and postponed revelations, then the burden of proof remains unmet. Now, this does not end the inquiry. I think it sharpens it. So the next step here is to examine why spectacle, especially artifacts and beings, we're talking about Dan Burish and his yellow box that he could peer into and see the future with the J-Rod. Well, this tends to capture the public imagination more effectively than infrastructure analysis, right? You'd rather watch a video than read text. That's all I'm saying. This is why movies are so powerful in changing our perspective of life and conditioning us into what they want us to believe. We think in pictures and video. We don't think in text. So there is a reason stories about artifacts endure. A gravity equation does not capture the imagination the way a glowing object does. Okay, when I write on a board the equation of gravity, okay, and I show you on a whiteboard and I go, here it is, that's gravity. Okay, and you look at that, then you look at a glowing object that's just floating there making no noise. Which one are you going to pay attention to? You're not going to pay attention to the fucking equation. You're going to look at the ball. Because we're like children, right? That's why we smoke cigarettes, because it replaced the thumb that we had to pull out of our mouth to grow up, and instead they just threw us cigarettes back in there to keep us like children. A procurement anomaly does not ignite curiosity the way a mysterious device does. Okay? Engineering constraints are quiet. Artifacts are dramatic. And the looking glass ecosystem understands this instinctively. In several branches of the broader S4 mythology, attention is drawn to visually compelling objects. The so-called yellow book or yellow box, described as an alien information device capable of displaying limitless knowledge, translating itself into the reader's thoughts, revealing history, even touching theology. Whether framed as a book, a cube, or a sphere, the function is the same. It is an object that bypasses engineering scrutiny and speaks directly to your freaking imagination. Now, let me take a step back. A little extra phlegmy today. Why all these data centers are building? That's evidence. Why all these data centers? To hold on to data. Why? To hold on to your pictures. Why? Well, so that we can access them anytime we want. Fine. But look at the bigger picture. Okay. We're paying them for these data centers, and they're putting stuff into it. Why do they need big data centers to hold all this data? Well, we've learned that Facebook sells meta, meaning all information behind the pictures, behind your text, everything that you do, every movement that you make, every thumb stroke you do. Why? Well, if they can collect all the data into one and build a super AI quantum computer that can go through all the data, it can predict the future. That gives more probability of something being worked on right now than something that Dan Burish did in the 60s, 70s, and a J-Rod alien that he practically almost made love to. Now, I want to believe, and I want to move towards the exotic glowing ball. But God and the Bible have totally put me right back down to the ground and said, logic. I'm not going to give you guys a bunch of stories that are not provable, that don't back up logic, sense, and true understanding. Now, an artifact like the glowing ball is powerful because it collapses complexity into a single focal point. Instead of asking how gravity is measured, how power is supplied, and how facilities are construed, the mind is invited to focus on an object that contains answers. Okay, just like the Mexican ball they have floating around in the sky, and all the Mexicans are showing this ball, and it's got all these little strange markings on it, and they say it's not of this world, and everyone's focused on the ball, but it doesn't do dick. They won't take the ball and throw it up in the air and show you it flies on its own. It just sits there on a desk. And they say, well, it was flying. So the artifact becomes a narrative shortcut. It absorbs attention that would otherwise drift towards structural questions. So this is not accidental in myth construction. Across cultures and eras, transformative objects carry stories because they are concrete. The Ark, the Grail, the Philosopher's Stone. Well, the device that sees the future. Well, the artifact is portable mystery here. So in the Looking Glass narrative, the artifact effects performs two psychological functions. First, it personalizes the story. An object can be touched, held, observed, described in sensory terms, and that makes the claim feel immediate and experiential, even if it cannot be independently examined. Second, it raises the stakes. When the artifact is said to contain infinite knowledge or influenced religion history, well, the story shifts from technical inquiry to existential significance. It's no longer merely about propulsion or weapons. It's about humanity's origins, destiny, and spiritual framework. That's a little too much. So that escalation makes calm engineering analysis feel almost trivial by comparison. But here's the critical distinction. Artifacts do not eliminate infrastructure requirements. If such an object existed, it would require containment protocols, materials analysis, radiation testing, reverse engineering labs, teams of physicists and engineers attempting replication. The existence of an artifact would amplify infrastructure demands and not reduce them. Yet in the narrative, the artifact, the yellow box that Dan Burris talks about, often stands alone. It's described in rich detail, but the industrial ecosystem around it remains vague, meaning it sits there in the room, nobody's playing around with it. It's like they've already gone through it. You know, the 100 years of actually studying this thing to see what it does? No, they just let the J-Rod touch it. Yeah. Who fabricated containment chambers? Who ran the spectroscopy? Who modeled the material composition? Who logged test failures? Where are the incremental breakthroughs that would naturally follow decades of artifact study? It's not there. And Dan doesn't talk about it. No. According to his story, he put on a spacesuit, went in there. J-Rod talked to him through his mind, and they fell in love with each other. Baby. Not like that. Kind of like a brother thing. The artifact absorbs the spotlight while the scaffolding fades into shadow. So this is what can be called the yellow artifact effect. Spectacle draws attention. Infrastructure recedes. Emotions expand. And auditability contracts. So again, this does not require intentional deception to function or as distraction. Human psychology gravitates toward the extraordinary. And in an environment where real classified programs are already secretive, it becomes easy for artifact-centered narratives to dominate discourse while infrastructure-centered analysis struggles for oxygen. And that's what I believe we're seeing here in the Looking Glass mythology. So the deeper the spectacle, the more it displaces structural questioning. And this brings us to one of the most striking claims in the Looking Glass mythology, the alleged timeline convergence event. It's what everybody wants to know because they feel like, oh my God, finally, it's an end to the devil. Well, the idea that future viewing revealed an inevitability around 2012, that's what everyone's literally gasping about. Well, that claim moves beyond artifact and into determinism. And determinism has consequences that can be tested against history. So at the peak of the Looking Glass mythology sits a decisive assertion that timeline observation revealed a convergence point around the year 2012. And the story varies in tone depending on who tells it. Some describe elite panic when all future timelines collapse into a single inevitability. Others describe a spiritual awakening event that could not be prevented. Still others frame it as a moment when predictive technology stopped working because history itself had reached a singular node. But regardless of interpretation, the structure of the claim is the same. The device allegedly allows observation of probable futures. Those futures reportedly began to narrow, and eventually they converged. And the convergence date often centers around 2012. Now remove the mysticism for a moment and treat this as a strategic capability claim. If a functioning device existed that could reliably observe future probability branches, even imperfectly, it would present the most powerful intelligence asset ever created. It would dwarf satellite reconnaissance. It would eclipse signal intelligence. It would render predictive analytics trivial by comparison. And it would alter deterrence doctrine. It would transform financial markets, and it would change how wars are planned and prevented. All of the evidence that you see before you of the more and more of our freedoms being taken away is more and more proof that this looking glass thing doesn't work. It's not real. So a government with access to operational future state modeling would behave differently. Uncertainty would shrink. Surprise would diminish. Strategic miscalculations would decline, and catastrophic intelligence failures would become rare. But Trump's a time traveler. Come on, people. I want to believe it. But all that's built to make us think like that so we don't focus on the bankers stealing our money. That's it. I'm sorry. Strategic miscalculations would decline. Catastrophic intelligence failures would become rare. Geopolitical crisis was resolved in strangely precise ways. So risk management would shift from probabilistic to anticipatory. Well, that's not speculation. That's consequence. Now look at the history surrounding 2012 and the decade that followed. The global financial crisis of 2008 was not prevented. The Arab Spring unfolded with instability and unpredictability. The Syrian conflict escalated chaotic fashion. Crimea and Ukraine triggered geopolitical realignment. Brexit shocked markets. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed institutional unpreparedness across continents. Strategic forecasting failures continued, and military miscalculations still persisted. And financial volatility remained real. Well, they just made it all look like that. That would take so much work and time, and that too would leave fingerprints and trails of us to know that they're faking all of that stuff. But nothing about global behavior after 2012 resembles a world governed by operational timeline certainty. Even if one argues that convergence meant inevitability rather than control, the narrative still implies foreknowledge. I don't think God's going to let us have that kind of tool. And if foreknowledge existed at a strategic level, we would expect to see consistent advantage in high-stakes domains. Instead, history appears messy, reactive, and uncertain. Well, that does not disprove the metaphysical possibility of time anomalies, and it does not challenge the operational claim. There is also a second problem with convergence narratives, retroactive flexibility. When 2012 passed without a visible singular event, nothing happened. Interpretation shifted. Convergence became subtle. Awakening became internal. And the failure of predictive control became the point. Well, the date lost specificity and gained abstraction. That claim adopted. That's right, Edge. Too many mistakes for Looking Glass to exist. Right. Look, I wanted to exist. I didn't want to do this report. I wanted there to be something. Yeah, man, they're playing with something, the Mandela effect. But dude, even the Mandela effect has fingerprints. So this adaptability is another hallmark of narrative immunity. When a forecast fails in concrete terms, it's reframed in symbolic ones. So the emotional core remains intact, but the measurable expectation dissolves. And the more extraordinary the predictive claim is, the more measurable the consequences should be. A gravity-time device capable of observing inevitability is not a symbolic tool. It is a strategic revolution. And revolutions in strategic capability leave behavioral signatures. So the absence of those signatures matter, folks. Again, this does not require ridicule. It requires alignment between claim and consequence. If timelines truly converged in a way that eliminated variability, we should see evidence of that in geopolitical behavior, economic patterning, and strategic forecast accuracy. But unfortunately, we do not. Which brings us back to filtration. The convergence claim intensifies the spectacle. It expands the mythology beyond engineering into destiny. So, yeah, right. The Mayan calendar, 2012, we're all supposed to die. Well, it's 2026 now. I thought we were all going to die. Then they went internally, guys. That's what I'm saying. Then they said, no, you died on the inside. Some of us ascended and we vibrated out of here. Oh my God. And the ones who didn't have the higher vibration, they were like, remained in hell here. And so we're all the bad guys. I'm sorry, data speaks louder than emotions. So the convergence claims intensifies the spectacle. It expands the mythology beyond engineering into destiny. But when tested against observable history, it does not align with the behavior of institutions supposedly in possession of such power. You see, if we had it, China would fake it, not fake it, they would build it. They would re-engineer it and build it. They would steal it from us, build it, then Russia. Now we're all playing around with the timeline. Dude, it would fuck up everything. No, just observable living proves there is no way to look into the future. So, and that pushes the investigation back toward a more grounded question. This is important. Where do legitimate oversight concerns end, and where does theatrical narrative begin? Well, at this stage, it's important not to swing too far in the opposite direction. Chill out, honey bunny. Just because the gravity-time narrative collapses under structural testing does not mean everything surrounding classified aerospace and special access programs is clean, transparent, and properly supervised. It's not. There are legitimate oversight questions. Special access programs exist. Some are acknowledged. Some are unacknowledged. Congressional read-in disputes have been occurred historically. Whistleblowers have testified about compartmentalization so tight that even senior officials struggle to gain visibility. Budget lines are sometimes buried in larger categories. Inspector General reviews have uncovered compliance failures in various domains of defense contracting and intelligence operations. So secrecy, yes, it can be misused. And it is misused all the time. And programs can be shielded excessively. Oversight mechanisms can lag behind technical acceleration. That stuff is real. But real oversight questions are specific. They revolve around procurement, authority chains, funding flows, and lawful reporting requirements. They're grounded in statutes, policy, and documented process. And they ask whether proper authorization exists, whether Congress was notified appropriately, whether contractors complied with federal acquisition regulations, and whether inspectors were blocked from reviewing certain compartments. So these are measurable disputes. And by contrast, the looking glass mythology operates in a different domain. It's secret. It does not focus on procurement irregularities or reporting violations. It centers on recovered alien craft, gravity lensing, time manipulation, mystical artifacts, and destiny convergence. It replaces statutory oversight language with mythic hierarchy language. It elevates the stakes from governance to cosmic revelation. And when those two domains are blended together without any distinction, then your clarity on the whole subject erodes. It becomes fantasy. It's a novel. It's a fictional thing. So a listener may begin with a legitimate question about SAP transparency and end up absorbing claims about engineered space-time and interspecies diplomacy. Are you insane? These are the people that believe there's a spaceship right out near Saturn's rings, and all the galactic people in the entire universe meet there. You know, let's disregard that, you know, Earth is not the only place in the world, but hey, they all meet near Earth. So Earth is still special for some reason. There's no logic in any of this stuff. So the emotional intensity of the latter can overshadow the procedural seriousness of the former. So this blending is dangerous, not because curiosity is wrong, but because conflation distorts its scale. And it becomes difficult to hold institutions accountable for real procedural failures if the conversation is dominated by gravity beams and timeline inevitability. Oversight requires precision. Myth invites totalization, and there is also a strategic cost. If public attention is consumed by extraordinary claims that lack structural backing, then the quieter, more consequential questions may never receive sustained focus. How are black budgets structured? How are emerging technologies integrated into doctrine? What guardrails exist for AI-enabled targeting systems? How does space-based sensing alter escalation dynamics? These are transformative issues. They deserve disciplined attention. So spectacle can function as noise, even if unintentionally. So the key is separation. So one of the questions, institutional secrecy without accepting gravity-time devices. One question, one can demand transparency where appropriate without embracing artifact mythology. One can acknowledge that real classified aerospace programs exist without leaping into interdimensional conclusions. So separation restores proportion. And the absence of evidence for looking glass, well, it does not erase the need for oversight in classified domains. But the presence of oversight disputes does not validate the looking glass claim. That distinction is the hinge on which discernment turns. And now we return to the final test, guys, the one that filters everything that we've examined so far tonight. Engineering versus story. Infrastructure versus atmosphere. Constraint versus coherence. What survives when the filtration is complete? Well, everything now reduces to a single question. Not whether secrecy exists, not whether governments lie, not whether black programs operate beyond public view. The question is simpler and more disciplined. Does the claim survive translation from story into structure? Well, we began with a coherent narrative spine, gravity propulsion, gravity weaponization, gravity time effects, and we translated those into engineering requirements, high energy systems, precision metrology, specialized facilities, sustained contractor ecosystems, safety protocols, multi-year funding streams. And we translated engineering into bureaucracy, procurement channels, oversight layers, review cycles, expertise pipelines, documentation flows. Then we looked for the fingerprints. If gravity were being lensed and time influenced in an operational research program, the supporting infrastructure would be immense. Immense. It would evolve over decades. It would generate institutional sediment. And even if the program name were hidden, the ecosystem around it would adapt. Power distribution patterns would shift. Material science domains would quietly accelerate in specific directions. Specialized instrumentation vendors would emerge. And career clusters would form. Test ranges would adapt. That is how the real-world revelations and capability behave. Now compare it to what we've actually observed in the looking glass ecosystem. We observed repeated nouns. We observed atmospheric authority language. We observed compartmentalization evolved as insulation. We observed deferred disclosure. We observed artifacts described in vivid sensory detail. We observed timeline convergence claims that did not manifest in measurable strategic behavior. What we did not observe is the industrial evolution that would accompany a gravity time breakthrough. Now, this is the difference between coherence and constraint. A story can be internally coherent without being externally constrained. It can align its parts elegantly, and it can escalate logically from propulsion to weapons to time. It can even embed defensive explanations for missing evidence. But physics does not negotiate with coherence. Bureaucracy does not disappear because a narrative says it does. If a claim changes the rules of space-time, it changes the rules of infrastructure. And infrastructure leaves traces. And the absence of those traces is not proof of impossibility. It is proof that the burden of proof remains unmet. That is the test. It's not ridicule. It's not belief. It's translation and filtration. And if tomorrow documentation surfaced showing contractor ecosystems, facility schematics, budget continuity, and metrology development consistent with gravity time research, the evaluation would then change. Evidence reshapes conclusions. But in the current documentary landscape, what survives filtration are three realities. Secrecy is real. Advanced aerospace programs are real. The looking glass gravity time device is unverified. And that distinction matters. Because when spectacle dominates discourse, serious inquiry loses oxygen. And that's what we've seen. When narratives fog thickens, well, structural accountability weakens. And the discipline is not to suppress curiosity, but to channel it toward constraints rather than atmosphere. It's engineering versus story here, folks. Okay? That's the dividing line. And once you learn to see it, you can apply it everywhere. So to conclude, what survives the filtration? Well, when the noise settles, what remains is not a feeling, it is structure. We began with the extraordinary claim: engineered gravity, lensed space-time, artificial manipulation of time, a device capable of observing future convergence. We did not dismiss it out of hand. We translated it. We asked what it would require physically. We asked what it would require institutionally. We asked what the footprint of such breakthrough would look like in the real world. Then we looked. We found repetition of names. We found coherent internal mythology. We found compartment language used as insulation. We found artifact and narratives designed to capture imagination. And we also found convergence claims that do not align with observable global behavior. What we did not find were the structural fingerprints that must accompany a revolution in physics. That absence really matters here. It does not mean secrecy is imaginary. It does not mean black programs are benign. It does not mean oversight concerns are illegitimate. Classified aerospace research is real. Special access programs are real. Institutional opacity is real. But those realities they operate inside physical and bureaucratic constraints. They leave sediment over time, and they generate indirect evidence, even when direct evidence is sealed. So the looking glass narrative does not show those patterns at all. Instead, it shows something else, a self-reinforcing ecosystem of story. It is internally elegant. It's emotionally potent. It escalates from propulsion to destiny in a way that feels complete, but completion inside a narrative does not equal confirmation inside reality. So the discipline that we applied tonight is simple and repeatable. If a claim alters physics, it alters infrastructure. If it alters infrastructure, it leaves fingerprints. And if fingerprints are absent, the burden of proof remains unmet. That's not cynicism. That is proportional evaluation. And perhaps the deeper lesson is this: spectacle thrives in the shadow of secrecy, and when institutions withhold information, even for legitimate reasons, imagination expands to fill the vacuum. Sometimes that imagination grows into myth, and sometimes it becomes distraction, but sometimes it becomes identity. Now, the task is not to extinguish curiosity. The task here is to anchor it. Curiosity without filtration becomes belief. Filtration without curiosity becomes denial, and discernment requires both. So what survives tonight's filtration is clear, in my opinion. There is no documentary evidence in the material examined that confirms an operational gravity time device called Project Looking Glass. There is evidence of secrecy. There is evidence of advanced aerospace development, yes. And there is evidence of bureaucratic opacity, yes. But there is not evidence of engineered space-time control, no. And that distinction restores the proportion here. The world is complex enough without adding physics revolutions that leave no trace. They don't. And real power already exists in aerospace acceleration, artificial intelligence, surveillance architecture, and strategic system integration. Those domains deserve scrutiny grounded in structure. So when you learn to translate story into infrastructure, you no longer have to choose between belief and mockery. You can choose simple analysis. And analysis, disciplined and patient, is far more powerful than spectacle or story time. This has been Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Tune in tomorrow night when God gives me another revelation to tell you guys all about. God bless you. God keep you. God thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.